The year was 1843, in Vicksburg, Mississippi. The river carried steamboats loaded with cotton, the pride of the South. But behind the riches of the town lay the endless fields, the sweat of men and women who never tasted freedom. Among them was a man named Ezekiel. Tall, with broad shoulders from years of labor, his eyes carried the weight of pain no whip could match. Day after day, he bent his body under the sun, cutting, hauling, obeying. To his master, he was only another tool, another name on the ledger. But inside Ezekiel burned a quiet fire. The plantation was a world of its own. The big house stood high on the hill, white walls shining as if proud of the cruelty within. Below, the slave quarters sat low and dark. Nights there were filled with whispers, children crying from hunger, mothers singing broken lullabies, men too tired to dream. Ezekiel sat among them, but he was different. His silence was heavy, and those who looked in his eyes saw something dangerous: resolve. He had reasons for that fire. His wife had been sold 2 winters before. His younger brother had been whipped until his body gave out. Ezekiel had buried too many hopes in the dirt of that land. Each day he bowed his head, but each night he told himself, this cannot last forever. The master was a cruel man, known in town for his temper. He beat Ezekiel for the smallest mistakes. He struck children for slowing their steps. His wife and children lived in comfort, eating from silver plates, never once touching the hands that gave them their wealth. To Ezekiel, their laughter was sharper than any lash. Every bite of food, every fine dress, was built on his suffering. One night, under the thin light of a candle in the slave quarters, Ezekiel sat alone. The other men had fallen asleep, but his mind was alive. He thought of his wife's face, the sound of her voice fading into memory. He thought of the scars on his brother's back. And then he thought of the master's face, smug and unbroken. That night, Ezekiel made a vow. Not whispered, not prayed, just a silent promise deep in his chest. The promise of revenge. The mornings on the plantation always began the same. Long before the sun rose, a horn echoed across the quarters. Men, women, even the smallest children stirred in the darkness. Their eyes opened heavy with sleep, but there was no time to rest. Work called, and work never waited. Ezekiel stood in the doorway of his cabin, the chill of dawn clinging to his skin. He watched as others gathered, mothers carrying babies on their hips, boys rubbing sleep from their eyes, old men limping forward with worn tools in hand. The overseer's shadow stretched long across the yard, whip coiled like a snake at his side. The day stretched into endless labor. Cotton fields shimmered under the rising sun, a cruel beauty masking the pain it demanded. Hands bled from thorns, backs bent under sacks heavy with white fluff. Every mistake was met with the crack of leather. A dropped bundle, a slowed step. The sound of punishment carried far. Ezekiel kept his head low, but inside the fire grew hotter. At midday, a thin meal was thrown their way. Corn mush, sometimes beans if fortune favored them. Ezekiel sat apart, his eyes scanning the big house in the distance. He could see the master's children running across the porch, their laughter ringing like bells. His jaw tightened. He remembered the small graves dug near the cabins. Children of the enslaved, gone from hunger and sickness, never once laughed over by anyone but their mothers. That contrast lived in Ezekiel's heart. He was forced to feed the very system that starved him. Each row of cotton he picked added coins to the master's pocket, coins that bought silk for his wife, toys for his sons, ribbons for his daughters. As the day burned on, Ezekiel found small moments of resistance and silence. A glance shared with another man. A song hummed low under his breath, a melody that carried secrets of freedom. At night, these songs grew louder in the cabins, hymns and work chants, words bent to carry hidden messages. Still, the danger was everywhere. Once, Ezekiel saw a boy of 10 caught whispering lessons from a stolen book. The master tore the book apart and beat the child until screams echoed through the night. Knowledge was forbidden. Hope was dangerous. And yet, It was in these very things that strength was born. Ezekiel lay awake again that night, the fire inside him no longer small. The day's sweat and pain pressed into his muscles, but his mind did not rest. He thought of escape, but he thought even more of balance. He wanted freedom, yes, but he also wanted the master to taste suffering, to feel the weight he had forced on others. As the moonlight slipped through the cracks of the cabin wall, Ezekiel whispered to himself for the first time, "The time will come." The summer of 1843 grew hotter, and with it, tempers on the plantation. Crops demanded more labor, days stretched longer, and punishments became harsher. The overseer's whip carved fresh scars into old wounds, and yet Ezekiel's silence only deepened. To the master, it looked like obedience. In truth, it was calculation. One evening, after the fields emptied and the cabins filled with weary bodies, Ezekiel stayed behind. He crouched near the rows, fingers brushing the soil. The earth smelled of sweat and blood. He thought of his wife, sold into the unknown, and his brother, lowered into a shallow grave. The weight of memory pressed heavy, but it did not break him. It hardened him. Later that night, as others gathered around a weak fire, whispers of sorrow turned into songs. The voices rose softly, trembling hymns that spoke of deliverance. Ezekiel did not sing. Instead, he watched the flames curl upward, each flicker a reminder that even the smallest spark could spread. That same week, a punishment pushed him closer to the edge. A young woman named Ruth, barely 16, had stumbled in the field, her body too weak to carry the load. The master struck her, his rage blind. Her cries cut through the air, a sound so sharp it silenced the workers around her. Ezekiel's fists clenched, but he forced himself still. To move too soon was to die without purpose. Yet inside, his vow tightened. No more. He began to test small acts of defiance. When ordered to carry loads, he slowed his steps, just enough to anger, but not enough to draw fatal blows. When a master's children demanded service, he stared longer than custom allowed, letting them feel the weight of his eyes. These were tiny things, invisible to most, but they were practice for control, practice for patience. One night, Ezekiel walked alone to the river's edge. The water shimmered under the moon, moving swift and dark. He picked up a stone, held it in his palm, then threw it hard into the current. The splash echoed like a promise. He imagined the master's face sinking beneath those waters, his cruelty washed away by the same river that carried cotton to markets. But Ezekiel knew imagination was not enough. He needed a plan, a careful one. The master had power, guards, dogs, guns. To strike blindly was suicide. Revenge required more than rage. It required patience sharper than any blade. So Ezekiel began to watch. He studied the routines of the house, the hours when a master drank heavy, the moments when the guards left gaps in their patrols, the nights when a family slept deep, their windows open to the summer heat. Every detail mattered, and Ezekiel stored them all like weapons. By the end of that month, the fire inside him was no longer hidden. It was alive, steady, and waiting. The time of endurance was over. The time of reckoning was near. The days on the plantation blurred into one another: sunrise, toil, hunger, and silence. But inside Ezekiel, something had shifted. He no longer lived only to survive. Every step he took, every glance he gave, was part of something larger. His heart beat steady, but his mind worked in shadows. At night, while others collapsed in his sleep, Ezekiel remained awake. He traced patterns in the dirt floor of his cabin, drawing lines with his finger, then wiping them away before dawn. These were not idle marks. They were maps, rough sketches of the plantation, the big house, the quarters, the paths of guards and dogs. Each mark carried purpose. Each erased line carried caution. The enslaved around him began to notice his silence, but none questioned it. To ask too much was dangerous. Still, one or two trusted him enough to share quiet nods of recognition. Among them was Ruth, the young girl once beaten in the field. Her eyes, though dim with pain, carried sparks of defiance. She became a reminder to Ezekiel of what he fought for: Not just vengeance, but dignity stolen too many times. During the long hours in the field, Ezekiel studied the master. He saw how the man drank heavily after sundown, how his anger grew clumsy with wine. He saw the master's wife retire early, safe in her illusions of gentility, never touching the hands that fed her table. He watched the children, careless in their laughter, never knowing the weight carried by those who served them. Each observation added weight to his plan. One evening, as the overseer barked orders, Ezekiel slowed near the tool shed. Inside lay axes, knives, and iron chains. To most, they were only instruments of labor or punishment. To Ezekiel, they were possibilities. His hand brushed against the handle of an axe, rough and heavy. He let it rest there a moment longer than needed before placing it back. He did not need it yet, but he would. The risk was enormous. One wrong move, and the whip would not be the worst fate. Runaway slaves were hunted, tortured, made into examples for others. But Ezekiel was not planning to run. His goal was not escape, it was balance. A life for a life. Pain for pain. As the moon grew full one night, he sat outside his cabin, staring into the dark fields. The cicadas sang, and the river in the distance whispered like a witness. Ezekiel spoke softly, his voice low but firm. "You took everything from me. Now I will take from you." The wind carried his words away, but the vow remained, carved deep in his chest. From that night forward, Ezekiel's days were no longer about labor. They were about waiting and preparing for the strike that would change everything. The nights in Vicksburg carried a silence that could crush the soul. The kind of silence where every sound, a snapping twig, a cough in the dark, rang louder than thunder. Ezekiel knew this silence well. He had lived under it for years. But tonight, he wasn't its prisoner. Tonight, it became his ally. He waited until the overseer's lantern passed by the cabins for the last time. The man staggered, half drunk, muttering curses under his breath. Ezekiel's eyes tracked his every move, noting the rhythm of his patrol. When the lantern disappeared into the distance, Ezekiel rose. Inside the cabin, others stirred lightly in sleep. A baby whimpered, hushed quickly by its weary mother. No one noticed Ezekiel slip outside. He moved with the ease of a man who had studied the ground beneath his feet for years. Each step was measured, silent, controlled. His destination, the tool shed. That same shed he had brushed past days ago. The wooden door creaked faintly as he eased it open. The smell of iron, oil, and wood filled his nose. His fingers found the axe handle again, rough, heavy, and waiting. He lifted it slowly, testing its weight. But this night was not for killing. Not yet. Instead, Ezekiel searched the shelves until his hand landed on a small flask of kerosene. He slipped it under his shirt. Then he found rope, frayed but strong. These were not weapons alone. They were pieces of a plan only he understood. He placed the axe back in its place. Patience was his weapon now. As he closed the shed door, he froze. A sound cut through the night. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. The overseer again. Ezekiel pressed himself against the shadow of the wall, barely breathing. The lantern's glow approached, casting long fingers of light across the dirt. The overseer stopped only a few feet away. He spat into the dirt, cursed about the mosquitoes, and stumbled off toward the barn. Ezekiel's body remained still as stone until the lantern finally disappeared. Only then did he move, each muscle trembling not with fear, but with the thrill of survival. Back inside his cabin, he tucked the kerosene and rope beneath loose floorboards he had pried up earlier. The secret was safe, for now. Around him, the others still slept, unaware of the storm he was preparing to unleash. He lay down, staring into the darkness above him. His mind replayed the overseer's steps, the master's drunken laugh, the cries of Ruth in the fields. Each sound was fuel, feeding the fire in his chest. For the first time since his family was torn away, Ezekiel allowed himself a small smile. Not of joy, but of certainty. The first move had been made, and soon there would be no turning back. The next evening, the air in Vicksburg was heavy with summer heat. The cicadas screamed from the trees, filling the silence with their endless cry. But for Ezekiel, Every sound was another reminder of how close danger sat around him. He had the kerosene. He had the rope. But a plan needed more than tools. It needed trust. And trust was dangerous here. As the cabin settled into uneasy quiet, Ezekiel leaned close to his bunkmate, a wiry man named Caleb. Caleb's back bore the scars of 100 lashes, his eyes sharp and cautious. Ezekiel whispered low, barely louder than the breath leaving his lungs. "Caleb, I need you to listen, and I need you to keep your mouth shut." Caleb frowned. "What are you stirring now, Zeke? You want us dead?" Ezekiel's gaze hardened. "We're already dying. Every day. I'm not waiting anymore." Caleb studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded slightly. "Tell me." Ezekiel explained only fragments. A fire, a distraction, a chance to strike when a master's guard was down. He did not reveal everything. Not yet. The less Caleb knew, the safer they both were if caught. Still, the risk of speaking at all made Ezekiel's chest tighten. And as if summoned by that fear, the door of the cabin burst open. The overseer's shadow filled the frame, lantern swinging in his hand. His eyes swept across the room, suspicious, hunting. "Who's talking?" he barked. The cabin went still. No one breathed. Ezekiel lowered his head, pretending to sleep. Caleb did the same. The overseer stepped inside, boots heavy on the wooden floor. He sniffed, muttered something about lazy dogs, then kicked over a bucket by the door. Water spilled, soaking the dirt floor. Ezekiel's muscles tensed as the lantern glow swept dangerously close to the loose floorboards where the kerosene was hidden. His heart pounded so loud he was sure the overseer could hear it. But after a moment, the man grunted and staggered back out into the night. The door slammed. Silence again. Caleb's breath shook in the dark. "Zeke!" Ezekiel cut him off. "Nearly doesn't matter. What matters is we move faster." His whisper carried more than words. It carried a promise. The risk was rising, the danger closing in, but Ezekiel's resolve only sharpened. The overseer's suspicion had brushed close, but instead of crushing him, it gave him strength. If they were going to live like hunted animals, then Ezekiel would strike like one too, quiet, patient, and lethal. The night was no longer his prison. It was becoming his weapon. The sun slipped low over Vicksburg, painting the sky in streaks of red and gold. For most, it was another evening of endless work, another day of chains and silence. But for Ezekiel, tonight was not routine. Tonight was the beginning. He moved quietly, carrying a bucket that looked no different from any other. Inside, mixed with scraps of rags, was the kerosene he had hidden. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of what he was about to do. The master's barn loomed at the edge of the fields, filled with tools, grain, and horses. It was not the master himself. Not yet, but it was his pride, his wealth. To Ezekiel, burning it was the same as cutting into his flesh. As dusk deepened, he slipped inside. The smell of hay and dust thickened the air. A lone lantern hung on a nail, its light flickering shadows across the wooden beams. Ezekiel set the bucket down. He tore the rags into strips, soaked them in kerosene, and laid them against the walls. Every move was careful, deliberate. His breathing slowed, steady as his resolve. He whispered to himself, almost like a prayer, "For my mother, for every lash, for every name they stole." His hand struck flint against stone. Sparks jumped, caught the rag, and in an instant a small flame licked the wood. It spread quick, faster than breath, climbing the wall with a hungry roar. Ezekiel stepped back, the firelight painting his face with a strange glow. Fear flickered inside him, but stronger still was a deep satisfaction. For the first time in his life, he was the one holding power. But then came the sound, hooves pounding the dirt. A stable boy, no older than 12, had seen the smoke rising. He cried out, "Fire! Fire!" His voice split the night, sharp and panicked. Ezekiel froze. This wasn't part of the plan. The boy's scream would bring the overseer, the dogs, maybe even the master himself. For a heartbeat, Ezekiel considered silencing him. His hand gripped the handle of a rusted tool lying nearby. But then he saw the boy's wide, terrified eyes. He was a child, enslaved like him, caught in the same cage. Ezekiel dropped the tool. He turned and vanished into the night as shouts rose behind him. From the fields, he watched. Flames devoured the barn, sparks leaping into the sky like stars breaking free. White men rushed with buckets, shouting orders, cursing slaves who stumbled under the weight of water. And through the chaos, Ezekiel felt it. Victory. Small but real. The first wound had been struck. The master's family would feel it, even if they didn't yet know whose hand had lit the match. Ezekiel whispered again, voice low and steady. This is only the start. The fire roared, and with it, so did his hunger for vengeance. The barn was nothing but blackened timbers by morning. Smoke still curled into the air, heavy with the smell of ash. The fields were silent, the workers too afraid to whisper. Everyone knew what came next. The master stood in front of the ruins, his face twisted with rage. His fine coat was smeared with soot, his boots sunk deep into the wet earth. His family gathered behind him, his wife clutching her shawl, his eldest son gripping a whip like it was part of his hand. This wasn't an accident, the master spat. His voice cut through the air like a blade. One of you did this, and you'll pay. The enslaved men and women stood in a line, their eyes fixed on the ground. Not one dared to move. The overseer paced slowly, his boots crunching on gravel, a pistol swinging at his side. Ezekiel stood among them, his face calm. Inside, his heart thundered. Smoke clung to his clothes. He was certain someone would smell it, but no eyes turned to him. Not yet. The master walked down the line, staring into each face. His anger was cold, sharp, almost worse than shouting. He stopped before a man named Caleb, an older slave with gray in his beard. You. The master's voice was low, dangerous. You've worked these fields longer than anyone. Did you see something? Caleb shook his head quickly. No, Sue. Just woke and saw the fire. The master's son cracked the whip in the dirt, the sound loud and cruel. He's lying, he sneered. They're all lying. They protect each other. The overseer stepped forward, grabbing a young girl from the line, barely 16. She screamed as he pulled her into the dirt. If no one speaks, the overseer growled, we'll make an example of her. Ezekiel's fists clenched. His chest burned. He wanted to shout, to strike, to end it there. But if he moved, everything would be lost. He forced himself still, jaw locked, eyes empty. The master raised his hand. Enough. His voice was calm again, which made it worse. He looked over the faces one by one. Until I know who did this, you'll all pay. Double work. Half rations. And if I find the guilty one, his eyes narrowed. There will be no mercy. A cold silence followed. The girl was shoved back into the line, sobbing softly. The whip snapped once more, a warning to them all. As the family turned and walked back toward the house, Ezekiel let out a slow breath. He had survived the master's wrath for now, but the punishment meant more suffering for everyone, and the weight of that pressed heavy on his chest. Still, in the shadows of his heart, a fire burned brighter than the barn. His revenge was far from finished. Night fell heavy over the plantation, the air thick with smoke and punishment. The enslaved men and women dragged themselves back to the cabins after hours of double labor. Their bodies ached, stomachs hollow, but worse than hunger was fear. Inside the small wooden cabin, shadows pressed close. The only light came from a dying ember in the corner. Ezekiel sat on the dirt floor, his back against the wall. His hands were rough and blistered, but his eyes were alive, burning brighter than the fire he had lit days before. Across from him sat Caleb, the old man the master had accused. His beard trembled as he spoke. They'll kill us all if you keep pushing, Ezekiel. Don't you see? Ain't no escape but death. Ezekiel leaned forward, his voice low, sharp. Death already lives here. Every lash, every chain, every night we sleep in fear. That's death. I won't bow to it no more. From a corner, a young woman named Ruth whispered. She was thin, her face scarred from past punishments. You talk brave, but words don't free chains. What's your plan, Ezekiel? He looked at them both. His voice carried a steel edge. The barn was a warning. Next, it's them. The master, his son, the family that feeds on our blood. Caleb shook his head, eyes wide with dread. That's suicide. You raise a hand against a white man's family. They'll hunt you till there's nothing left but bones in the dirt. Ezekiel's jaw tightened. He remembered his mother's cries, his brother sold downriver, the scars carved into his back. Then let them hunt. But before they do, they'll know fear. They'll know what it is to lose. The cabin fell silent. Outside, the sound of night insects buzzed, broken by the occasional bark of a hound in the distance. The smell of damp earth filled the air. Ruth's voice broke the stillness. If you do this, you can't do it alone. Her eyes met his, steady and fierce. I'll help. Ezekiel studied her face, the scars, the strength hidden in her small frame. He gave a single nod. Then it begins. Caleb turned away, muttering prayers under his breath. He wanted no part of it, yet he did not speak a word to stop them. Ezekiel stood, his figure outlined by the faint red glow of the embers. Tomorrow, I'll watch them. I'll learn their steps, their guard, their weakness. When the time comes, his voice dropped to a whisper. The master's blood will fall into the same dirt as ours. The wind rattled the cabin walls, as if carrying his words into the night. And for the first time, Ruth smiled, not with joy, but with the grim fire of someone ready to fight. The next morning came with no mercy. The overseer's whistle split the dawn, dragging the slaves into the fields before the sun was fully risen. Sweat and dust already clung to their skin as they bent to the rows of cotton. Ezekiel moved with the others, stooping, pulling, his hands raw. To any watching eye, he was just another broken man working the master's land. But behind his lowered gaze, his eyes were sharp, tracking every detail beyond the rows of cotton. At the far end of the field, the master's son rode on horseback. He was young, barely in his 20s, but cruel in ways that made the older men flinch. The whip cracked in his hand, not always to punish, sometimes only to hear the sound. Ezekiel's eyes narrowed. The son always circled the same path, always carried the whip, always returned to the big house just before midday. A routine, a pattern. From the corner of his eye, Ezekiel also watched the master himself. Each morning he walked to the porch with a silver cup, drinking slowly as if the world belonged to him. His wife stayed inside, sewing by the window, her face pale and still. Guards came and went, but their movements were lazy, careless, softened by habit. Ezekiel memorized it all. The times, the distances, the weak spots where eyes turned away. When the midday bell rang, the workers were driven back toward the cabins for a short meal. Ezekiel slipped to the side, crouching near the edge of the field. The big house loomed in the distance, its white paint glowing in the sun, a cruel symbol of power. Ruth joined him, carrying a small sack of cornmeal. She sat as if resting, but her eyes followed his. "What do you see?" she asked softly. Ezekiel pointed with his chin. "The boy rides careless. Always the same path. The master trusts the guards too much. They don't watch close. And at night," he lowered his voice, "there's only one man at the stable. Alone." Ruth's face tightened. "You're thinking of the son first." "Yes," Ezekiel said. His voice was steady, his jaw set. "Cut the snake's head in pieces, one by one. The family will bleed before the master feels the blade himself." Ruth's hands trembled as she gripped the sack. "Once we start, there's no turning back." Ezekiel looked at her, eyes burning like coals. "I turned back 1,000 times before, and still I wore chains. No more." A whistle shrieked. The overseer barked for them to return. Ezekiel stood, dust rising from his clothes, his face once again calm, unreadable. But inside, his mind was alive, sharper than it had ever been. Every step of the master's family was now a piece on his board, and Ezekiel was ready to move. The sun bled low over the fields, painting the sky with streaks of red. Work was ending for the day, but no one dared to lift their head until the overseer gave the word. The master's son sat tall on his horse, whip in hand, circling like a vulture. His laughter was sharp, cruel, echoing across the rows. Ezekiel bent low, picking cotton with slow, steady hands. His eyes, though, were not on the plants. They followed the young master's every move, measuring distance, counting rhythm. The boy always stopped near the oak tree at the edge of the field. always leaned from the saddle to shout, to spit, to flaunt his power. And always his back was turned to the workers for just a breath too long. That breath was all Ezekiel needed. When the whistle blew and the slaves began to shuffle toward the cabins, Ezekiel lingered. He let the others move ahead, his steps slower, deliberate. His fingers brushed the handle of a small, rusted blade he had hidden inside his sleeve, a tool stolen from the barn, sharpened against stone. Ruth walked beside him, her voice barely a whisper. Tonight, Ezekiel's jaw tightened. Tonight, as the workers filed past the oak, the master's son reined his horse, watching them with a sneer. Lazy rats, he spat. You'll work twice as hard tomorrow. He cracked the whip into the dirt, laughing at their flinch. Ezekiel stepped forward, his hand curling around the blade. The noise of feet shuffling on dry earth filled the air. His heart pounded like a drum, each beat pushing him closer to the edge. Then chaos. One of the younger boys tripped and fell, scattering his bundle of cotton. The sun turned sharply, roaring with laughter, his whip snapping across the child's back. The boy cried out, his small hands clawing at the dirt. The sound stabbed Ezekiel deeper than any lash. His breath caught, his vision darkened. Rage surged, pulling him forward like a tide. But Ruth's hand gripped his arm, hard, stopping him. Her eyes cut into his, fierce and desperate. Not now, she hissed. Too many eyes. You'll lose everything. Ezekiel froze. The blade trembled in his grip, his knuckles white. For a long, burning moment, he wanted nothing more than to bury it in the boy's flesh, to silence the whip forever. Instead, he slipped the blade back into his sleeve. His chest heaved, but his face remained calm as stone. He forced himself to turn away, to walk back toward the cabins, each step heavy with fury. Behind him, the master's son rode off, laughing, unaware of how close death had brushed him. In the dark of the cabin later that night, Ezekiel whispered to Ruth, his voice low and cold. Next time, I won't stop. And the fire in his heart burned hotter, waiting for its chance. The house was silent now. The screams had faded into whispers carried by the Mississippi wind. Ezekiel stood in the doorway, chest rising and falling, sweat mixed with ash. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the weight of what he had done. The master's family, the very people who had whipped him, starved him, sold his friends, lay scattered in the ruins of their own cruelty. Outside, the night was strangely calm. The cicadas hummed, the river moved as it always did, and the stars burned above as if nothing had happened. But for Ezekiel, everything had changed. He was no longer the man in chains. He was the man who chose to fight back, no matter the cost. He walked slowly across the yard, past the cabins where so many had suffered. Some of the enslaved still hid in the shadows, afraid to believe what they had seen. Ezekiel stopped, lifted his head, and said in a low, steady voice, "It's over. You are free." His words trembled in the night air. For the first time, hope flickered in their eyes. But freedom was not so simple. He knew patrols would come. He knew the law would never forgive him. In Mississippi, a slave who killed his master was marked for certain death. Still, he felt no regret. Revenge had burned inside him for too long, and tonight it had finally been answered. Some whispered that Ezekiel fled north, following the river, slipping into the forest where bounty hunters dared not go. Others swore he joined the Maroons, hidden bands of escaped slaves who fought like shadows in the swamps. And a few believed he was captured, hanged in the Vicksburg square as a warning to others. The records are silent. His true fate remains a mystery. But his story survived, carried in the voices of those who watched it happen. Mothers told it in hushed tones to their children. Old men whispered it by the fire. And with each telling, Ezekiel became more than a man. He became a symbol of defiance, a reminder that even in the darkest days, courage could rise from chains. Nearly 2 centuries later, the story of Vicksburg's revenge still lingers. It is a story of pain, but also of power. A story that forces us to ask, what would you do if the world stripped away your humanity? Would you bow forever? Or would you rise, even if it cost everything? The candle burns low. The voices fade. And the question remains, echoing through time. The slave who took revenge on his master's entire family. His name may be forgotten by books, but his fire still lives. If you found this story powerful, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel for more untold stories from history.